My brother leaned close enough that I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and said, "If it wasn't for pity, no one here would have invited you." The music kept playing behind us. Laughter drifted across the ballroom. Crystal glasses clinked somewhere near the bar. No one else seemed to notice the quiet little execution happening beside the wine table. I took a slow sip of red wine and let the silence sit between us. 21 years had passed since the last time we stood this close. He still thought I was the outcast he had thrown out. What he didn't know, what almost no one in that room knew, was that in less than 5 minutes the bride was going to raise a glass and introduce the secret investor holding his company's $50 million lifeline, me. If you've ever been underestimated by your own blood, tell me where you're watching this story from in the comments below. The Hudson Valley Estate Ballroom smelled of imported white roses and old money. Waitstaff navigated the crowded floor, carrying silver trays of caviar and champagne. Otis stood before me in a tailored velvet tuxedo. He looked the part of a successful patriarch. I looked past his shoulder. In a quiet corner near the terrace doors, Corbin sat on the edge of a velvet armchair. He was the groom, my nephew. He ignored the wealthy guests to carefully tuck a thin cashmere blanket over the legs of his 10-year-old sister, Lena. She offered her brother a bright smile. That smile did little to hide the dark circles under her eyes. The collar of her flower girl dress barely concealed the medical port near her collarbone. The contrast was sharp enough to cut glass. Otis was hosting a $250,000 wedding reception while rationing the medical care of his own daughter. Otis followed my gaze and scoffed. He turned his attention back to my simple navy sheath dress. The fabric carried no visible designer logo. It was unremarkable. To him, it was physical proof of my failure. Still shopping at discount racks? I see. Otis muttered. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. I am surprised you could afford the gas to drive up here. Or did you take a bus? I let the insult hang in the air. I didn't defend my wardrobe. I didn't mention the dress was bespoke, tailored by hand in Milan. Let him keep his assumptions. Ignorance was the only place he felt safe. I glanced down at my wrist. My silver watch caught the chandelier light. The hands read 7:45 in the evening. 45 minutes left. That was all the time Otis had remaining in his manufactured reality. Soon, the facade would crack. You always were quiet when you knew you were out of your depth, he added. His voice carried a tone of unearned superiority. Just stay out of the formal photos. We have important investors here tonight. People who actually matter. I lifted my glass of Pinot Noir. I took another slow sip. The wine was dry and ordinary. I lowered the glass and finally met his eyes. My expression remained neutral. I didn't frown. I didn't glare. I just looked at him the way a mechanic looks at a broken engine. He shifted his weight. The silence was starting to itch at him. He wanted a reaction. He needed me to shrink, to argue, to play the victim he had created 2 decades ago. I gave him nothing. He adjusted his silk tie, suddenly uncomfortable under my steady gaze. "Enjoy the free meal," he snapped. He turned on his heel to greet a passing couple, forcing a wide, artificial smile onto his face. I watched him walk away. Enjoy your final hour. Otis's medical supply company was a sinking ship. He walked through the ballroom, shaking hands and patting backs, pretending he owned the ocean. Internal documents told a different story. I had read the quarterly reports. I knew the numbers better than his own accountants. The company was drowning in debt due to his reckless expansions and luxury lifestyle. He owed vendors across 3 states. Production lines were stalling. He needed a $50 million cash injection by the end of the month just to make payroll and keep the creditors at bay. He had spent the last 6 months aggressively courting the Apex Health Trust for that loan. This wedding was his ultimate pitch. He rented the most expensive estate in the valley. He hired a Michelin-starred chef. He invited every venture capitalist and hospital director in his contact list. Emma, the bride, was the daughter of a major regional healthcare executive. Otis orchestrated this marriage as a strategic merger. He was using his son's wedding as a theatre production to convince the market he was solvent. I watched him clink glasses with a state senator. The hypocrisy was a physical weight in the room. He spent thousands on imported orchids while Corbin spent his nights arguing with insurance adjusters. Lena's condition required a specific, expensive treatment protocol. Otis held the legal guardianship and the purse strings. He systematically slashed her care budget, claiming the business needed temporary liquidity. He traded his daughter's oxygen for champagne toasts. A waiter passed by with a tray of truffle appetizers. I shook my head, keeping my focus on the room. Otis believed the Apex Health Trust was a faceless corporate entity. He sent them glossy brochures and optimistic projections. He didn't know the board of directors had rejected his proposal twice. He didn't know the only reason his application was still alive was because the CEO intervened. He operated on the assumption that power was always loud. He thought wealth announced itself with branded watches and rented luxury cars. He measured a person's worth by the noise they made when they entered a room. He never understood that real leverage operates in silence. It sits in the back of the room, sipping red wine, holding the paperwork. Corbin left Lena's side for a moment to speak with the catering manager. He looked exhausted. His tuxedo fit perfectly, but his shoulders slumped under an invisible burden. He was trapped in his father's orbit, playing the dutiful son to keep the peace. He thought he was alone in this fight. He thought the system was rigged against him and his sister. I took a breath. The air conditioning hummed faintly over the sound of the string quartet. The pieces were all in place on the board. The game was already over. The tempo of the string quartet shifted. The heavy wooden doors at the grand entrance swung open. The room fell into a polite hush as guests turned their attention. Emma stepped into the ballroom. Her white gown trailed gracefully across the polished hardwood floor. Otis immediately abandoned his conversation with the state senator. He practically sprinted across the room to reach her side. He offered his arm with an exaggerated bow, playing the role of the doting, generous father-in-law for the audience. Emma accepted his arm, keeping her posture straight. She smiled at the guests, but her eyes remained sharp and observant. Emma's father, Dr. Harrison, stood near the stage. He was the director of the largest medical network in the state. Otis needed Harrison's endorsement to secure the Apex loan. Otis leaned in and whispered something to Emma, gesturing expansively toward the room. He was taking credit for the elegance of the evening. Emma nodded politely at his words. She began to scan the crowd. She looked past the rows of wealthy executives. She looked past the local politicians holding their champagne flutes. The socialite bride moved her gaze through the sea of familiar faces until she found the back corner of the room. Her eyes locked onto mine. I stood beside the wine table, still holding my glass. To the rest of the room, I was just an aging relative in a plain dress. Otis believed Emma had no idea who I was. He had likely briefed her on the family history, painting me as a distant failure, not worth her time. He assumed she would look right through me. She didn't. Emma's formal, practiced expression softened. A genuine, knowing smile touched her lips. It wasn't a smile of pity or polite acknowledgement. It was a look of profound recognition. Slowly, deliberately, she dipped her chin in a subtle nod. I returned the gesture, lowering my head just a fraction of an inch. Otis noticed her distraction. He turned his head to see what had captured her attention. When he saw me standing there, his jaw tightened. He quickly stepped between us, blocking her line of sight. He placed a guiding hand on Emma's shoulder, steering her toward the center of the dance floor where the photographer was waiting. He thought he was protecting his investment. He thought he was shielding his new daughter-in-law from the family embarrassment. He had no idea what that nod meant. He didn't know the conversations that had taken place behind closed doors over the past month. Otis smiled for the cameras. The flashbulbs erupted in a rapid sequence, capturing his manufactured triumph. I set my wine glass down on the white linen tablecloth. He was smiling at a ghost. The flash of the cameras pulled a memory forward. 21 years ago, there were no photographers. There was only the sound of heavy rain hitting the porch roof and the sharp click of a deadbolt sliding into place. The house smelled of stale funeral lilies and lemon furniture polish. The car crash had taken our parents quickly. The shock left the house, quiet and hollow. Otis was 39 years old. He stepped into the vacuum of leadership without hesitation. I was 19, still trying to process the empty chairs at the dining table. 2 days after the burial, Otis walked into the living room. He wore a dark suit and carried a single canvas duffel bag. He dropped the bag at my feet. The thud echoed against the hardwood floor. He didn't yell. He didn't lose his temper. He simply handed me a coat. He informed me that the house and the business were now under his control. He said my presence was a liability to his new vision for the family. He told me I had 10 minutes to pack whatever fit in that bag. I stood there, numb. I asked about the trust our parents had mentioned. He laughed, a dry, scraping sound. He claimed the estate was heavily in debt and there was nothing left. He pushed me toward the front door. The porch lights were off. The autumn rain was freezing. I walked down the driveway with the bag cutting into my shoulder. I didn't cry until I reached the end of the street. The physical eviction was only the beginning. Otis spent the next few months systematically erasing me from the family tree. He called our aunts and uncles. He spoke to family friends. He spun a narrative that I had stolen our mother's jewelry to fund a dangerous habit. He told them I ran away in the middle of the night because I couldn't face my own guilt. He painted himself as the long-suffering older brother who had tried to save me. He made sure every bridge was burned before I even had a chance to cross it. When I tried to call a cousin for a place to sleep, the phone clicked dead. The isolation was swift and absolute. He expected me to end up exactly where his rumors placed me. He expected me to spiral, to fail, to eventually crawl back to his doorstep, begging for loose change. It would have validated his narrative. It would have proven him right. I stood in the ballroom, watching him shake another hand. The memory faded back into the dark. My shoulder didn't ache from the bag anymore. He never saw me coming. People often ask why someone simply walks away from their own inheritance. They wonder why a 19-year-old girl didn't hire a lawyer, contest the eviction, or fight for her rightful place in the family. The answer is not simple. It lives in the quiet, dark corners of a transactional childhood. When you grow up in a house where affection is a currency, you learn the exchange rate early. Otis spent my entire life setting the market. He was 20 years older. He was the heir apparent. I was the unexpected, late arrival. He conditioned the household to view my presence as a burden. If I argued, I was difficult. If I asked for my share, I was ungrateful. Psychologists call it learned helplessness. You spend years throwing yourself against a locked door until your brain finally decides the door is a wall. You stop trying to open it. You just sit on the floor. On the night he threw my bag onto the porch, I didn't have the energy to fight. I had spent 19 years trying to prove I belonged at that dining table. Otis had spent 19 years proving I didn't. The cold autumn rain was harsh, but it was honest. Inside the house, the cruelty was always disguised as practical business. I walked to the bus station that night with $30 in my pocket. I didn't call the police. I didn't look for a pro bono attorney. I believed his narrative. I genuinely thought the business was failing and the debts were real. I thought my parents had left nothing behind. Otis had isolated me so thoroughly that his voice became my internal monologue. It takes years to unlearn that kind of conditioning. You have to actively dismantle the cage someone else built in your mind. You have to wake up every morning and remind yourself that the person who hurt you does not get to write your biography. The bus ride to the city took 4 hours. I stared out the window at the dark highway, listening to the hum of the tires. Every mile put distance between me and the only home I had ever known. But it also put distance between me and Otis's control. The invisible chain he had wrapped around my neck was beginning to stretch. It would take a decade to break it completely. But the first crack happened the moment I realized I didn't need his permission to exist. I didn't look back. The process of rebuilding a life from zero leaves scars. There were no cinematic montages of sudden success. There was only the grind. I rented a room above a noisy laundromat. I worked the morning shift at a bakery, the evening shift at a call center, and took community college classes online late into the night. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Through those years, I held on to a single anchor. My grandfather, Walter, he passed away when I was 12. Long before the car crash that took my parents. Walter built the family medical supply business from a single storefront. He was a quiet, observant man. He saw right through Otis's bravado. Walter used to sit with me on the back porch, peeling apples with a pocket knife. He taught me how to read a balance sheet before I learned algebra. He told me numbers don't lie, even when the people presenting them do. "Power doesn't need to shout, Jessica," he said to me once. He pointed to a loud, aggressive blue jay bullying other birds at the feeder. The loudest bird is usually the most desperate. The hawk doesn't make a sound until the hunt is over. I kept his words folded in my mind. They became my compass. I graduated with a degree in finance. I started as a junior analyst at a mid-sized healthcare investment firm. I didn't try to make friends. I didn't attend office parties. I focused entirely on the data. I learned the intricate mechanics of hospital funding, medical supply chains, and corporate acquisitions. I moved up the ladder quietly. I absorbed information. I noticed patterns other people missed. By the time I was 32, I had orchestrated 3 major mergers. by 35. I had the capital and the network to step out on my own. I didn't build my career to exact revenge on my brother. Anger is a terrible investment strategy. It clouds your judgment and forces your hand. I built my career because I wanted absolute independence. I wanted a fortress so strong that no one could ever pack my bags and throw them on a porch again. 12 years after the night I was evicted, I launched Apex Health Trust. I structured it as a dark pool fund. My name wasn't on the public letterhead. I operated behind a board of directors and a wall of non-disclosure agreements. We invested in medical technology and stabilized failing regional hospitals. I became the hawk. I flew high above the noise, watching the market below. I never checked up on Otis. I didn't care about his expanding house or his country club memberships. His world was irrelevant to mine, until his loan application crossed my desk. Apex had a strict vetting process. When the file for Hayes Medical Solutions appeared in the risk assessment queue, my compliance officer flagged it for severe financial instability. I sat in my office overlooking the skyline, staring at the name on the folder. 21 years of silence collapsed into a single document. Otis had spent 2 decades destroying the company Walter built. He treated the corporate accounts like a personal ATM. The financial autopsy was staggering. He had leveraged the core assets to buy luxury real estate. He had taken out questionable loans to cover shortfalls in production. But the worst discovery was not the corporate debt. It was the personal ledger. When I dug deeper into the family trust accounts, looking for collateral, I found a secondary file. It belonged to Lena. Lena was born with a rare, chronic autoimmune disorder. The treatment required a specialized biological therapy that cost thousands of dollars a week. Walter had anticipated this. Before he died, he set up a specific medical trust designed to cover catastrophic health needs for his descendants. The funds were supposed to be untouchable for any other purpose. Otis was the legal custodian of that trust. Over the past 3 years, as his company began to hemorrhage cash, Otis started siphoning money from Lena's medical fund. He exploited legal loopholes, classifying experimental corporate investments as future family assets to justify the withdrawals. He drained the account meant to keep his own daughter alive. He rationalized it. Narcissists always do. He likely convinced himself that saving his company was the only way to save the family. He believed his title as CEO was more important than the treatment schedule of a 10-year-old girl. The consequences were immediate. Lena's therapy was downgraded to a cheaper, less effective alternative. Her health began to decline. Corbin, Otis's son, was 24 at the time. He worked in the company's lower management. Corbin stumbled across the altered medical invoices while covering a shift in the accounting department. He confronted his father behind closed doors. I can only imagine the scene. A desperate son pleading for his sister's life. A cornered father lashing out to protect his ego. Otis didn't apologize. He threatened Corbin. He told his son that if the company went under, they would all be on the street. He demanded Corbin's loyalty. He demanded silence. To secure the Apex loan, Otis needed to present a picture of perfect stability. That included a high-profile marriage to Emma, tying his sinking ship to her father's successful healthcare network. He forced Corbin into the arrangement, holding Lena's remaining medical care hostage as leverage. Play the part of the happy groom, or the medical payments stop entirely. Otis sacrificed his daughter's lungs to inflate his own pride. It was a betrayal so fundamental it defied logic. I sat in my office, reading the digital trails. The numbers painted a portrait of a monster. 6 months before the wedding, my private phone rang. It was past midnight on a Tuesday. Only 5 people in the world had that number. The caller ID displayed an unknown area code. I answered the call. I didn't speak. "Hello," a voice said. It was thick with exhaustion and panic. Is this Jessica Hayes?" I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud by family in over 2 decades. I leaned forward in my chair. "Who is speaking?" "It's Corbin," the voice cracked. "Your nephew." The last time I saw Corbin, he was a toddler playing with wooden blocks on the living room rug. Now, he sounded like a man standing on the edge of a bridge. "How did you get this number?" I asked. My tone remained guarded. "I hired a private investigator." Corbin confessed. The line crackled with static. "I didn't know what else to do. Dad said you were dead, or in prison. But the investigator found the connection to the holding company." He took a ragged breath. The sound of quiet crying echoed through the receiver. "Please," he whispered. "I know he did terrible things to you. I know why you left. But I need help. It's my little sister. It's Lena." I closed my eyes. The walls I had built over 21 years were thick, but they were not soundproof. I listened as Corbin poured out the truth. He confirmed everything I had seen in the financial files. He explained the blackmail. He described watching his sister struggle to breathe while his father ordered expensive wine for the wedding tasting. "The hospital called today," Corbin continued, his voice shaking. "Dad's latest check for her treatment bounced. The clinic is threatening to halt her specialized care by the end of the month. The wedding is in 2 weeks. He told me to just smile for the cameras, and he'll fix it later. He won't fix it. He's going to let her die to save his pride." Corbin wasn't asking for money. He was asking for a miracle. He was a kid trapped in a burning building, calling the only person who had ever managed to escape the fire. "I'll sign whatever you want." Corbin begged. "I'll give up my shares. Just help me get her out of his custody. Please." I looked at the framed photograph on my desk. It was a picture of my grandfather, Walter, sitting on the porch. Power doesn't need to shout. "Stop crying, Corbin," I said quietly. The line went still. He caught his breath. "Listen to me carefully," I instructed. "You are going to proceed with the wedding. You are going to smile for the cameras. You are going to give your father exactly what he wants." "But Lena—" "I will handle Lena," I interrupted. "Do not confront him again. Do you understand?" "Yes," he whispered. "I'll see you at the reception." I hung up the phone. The silence in my apartment felt different now. It was no longer a shield. It was a staging ground. For 21 years, I had believed that staying away was the ultimate victory. I thought my absence was my armor. But Corbin's call exposed a fatal flaw in my logic. Walking away had protected me, but it had left the rest of the family at the mercy of a tyrant. Otis had not changed. He had merely found new victims. I walked over to my desk and opened my laptop. I didn't feel a rush of vengeance. I didn't punch the wall. I felt the cold, methodical clarity of a surgeon preparing to excise a tumor. The next morning, I initiated a series of quiet directives. I contacted Emma's father, Dr. Harrison. As the head of the medical network, he was a key player. I arranged a private meeting. I showed him the bounced checks. I showed him the drained medical trust. I laid out Otis's true financial standing. Dr. Harrison was a man of integrity. He was disgusted. He had suspected Otis was over-leveraged. But the exploitation of a sick child crossed a moral line he could not ignore. "My daughter is marrying into this family." "Doctor," Harrison said, his expression grim. "What do we do?" "We let the wedding happen," I replied. "Emma loves Corbin. Corbin is a good man. He is a victim in this too. We don't punish the son for the sins of the father." I outlined the plan. Apex Health Trust would secretly absorb Lena's medical debt immediately. We transferred her care to Doctor, Harrison's premier facility, under a proxy account. Otis would assume the hospital was extending him professional courtesy due to the impending marriage. He would mistake our intervention for his own cleverness. Let him. Arrogance is a blindfold. Then I instructed my legal team to move on Otis's corporate debt. We didn't issue warnings. We systematically bought up the promissory notes from his terrified vendors. We consolidated his liabilities under the Apex umbrella. Otis thought he was negotiating a new $50 million loan to save his empire. He didn't realize his empire had already been purchased, piece by piece, from the outside in. I spent the 2 weeks leading up to the wedding, reviewing contracts and signing transfer deeds. I bought a simple navy dress. I booked a flight to New York. I was finally returning to the family table. This time, I owned the house. The crystal chandeliers cast long shadows across the ballroom floor. Waiters in white gloves circulated with silver trays, offering champagne to guests who already held full glasses. I stood near a marble pillar, observing the delicate ecosystem of Otis's peers. These were men who inherited their starting lines. They discussed stock portfolios, summer homes in the Hamptons, and golf handicaps with casual entitlement. They wore custom Italian tuxedos and spoke in the hushed, confident tones of people who had never worried about a late fee. My starting line was a canvas duffel bag and a one-way bus ticket in the pouring rain. People often assume that building wealth from nothing requires a sudden stroke of luck or a fortunate connection. It doesn't. It requires a specific tolerance for pain. In my 20s, I lived in a damp studio apartment situated directly above a commercial dry cleaner. The sharp, chemical smell of perchloroethylene seeped through the floorboards every single night. The constant hum of the industrial washing machines vibrated through my thin mattress, making sleep a rare luxury. I worked the morning shift taking inventory at a bakery, the evening shift fielding angry calls at a customer service center, and took community college classes online until my eyes burned. I ate cheap instant noodles. I studied financial regulatory laws, corporate tax structures, and asset management until the text blurred into meaningless shapes. I didn't have a safety net. I didn't have a mentor opening doors or making introductions for me. I had a library card and a quiet, burning resolve. Otis threw me out, believing the world would swallow me whole. He assumed I lacked the pedigree to survive without the family name. He didn't understand that hitting rock bottom provides a very solid foundation to build upon. I watched a local venture capitalist laugh at one of Otis's jokes near the ice sculpture. The capitalist didn't know Otis's balance sheets were bleeding red ink. In this room, perception was currency. Otis had spent 21 years meticulously curating a perception of success. He wore the right brands, joined the exclusive country clubs, and leased the right imported cars. He built a precarious house of cards based on handshakes and empty promises. I built a brick wall based on compound interest and legal leverage. The wine in my glass tasted bitter, but I didn't mind. It kept me grounded in the present. I looked around the room, taking a mental inventory of the power players Otis was trying to impress. They were eating caviar and talking about the future, blind to the fact that the host of the party was already a relic of the past. The facade was perfect, but perfection is always the easiest thing to shatter. I took a slow breath. The music shifted to a softer, melodic tempo. The guests continued to mingle, blissfully unaware of the financial execution scheduled for tonight. I didn't need to raise my voice to tear down his fragile empire. The paperwork was already filed in a downtown office. I simply had to wait. Otis thrived in the spotlight. He moved fluidly from table to table, clapping shoulders and pouring expensive wine for the regional directors. He thought he was the most powerful man in the room. He believed he was conducting a masterclass in corporate networking. He was wrong. Apex Health Trust was a ghost by design. When I founded the firm a decade ago, I made a conscious decision to remain in the shadows. The medical supply industry is a remarkably small world. If Otis had ever seen my name printed on a public letterhead, his fragile ego would have triggered an irrational, destructive response. He would have deliberately sabotaged his own company's supply chains just to deny me a seat at the negotiating table. He preferred ruin over concession. So I operated exclusively through proxy boards, blind trusts, and anonymous holding accounts. My signature was buried under layers of corporate structuring. I scanned the room. 3 of the hospital administrators currently drinking Otis's aged scotch were actually on the Apex payroll. They reported directly to my managing director in the city. They were attending this wedding to evaluate Otis's character in a social setting, not to praise his business acumen. They knew the truth. We already owned the majority of his outstanding debt. Doctor? Harrison stood near the grand curved staircase. He caught my eye through the crowd and gave a brief, subtle nod. The gears were turning exactly as planned. Emma's father knew the reality of the situation. He knew the $50 million lifeline Otis desperately needed to avoid bankruptcy was never going to materialize. Instead, Apex Health was preparing a hostile takeover, utilizing the defaulted loans as leverage. Otis approached Dr. Harrison with a wide grin. He threw an arm around the older man's shoulder, posing for a nearby photographer hired to document the evening. Otis looked like a victorious king surveying his expanding domain. He had no idea his crown was already stripped and sitting in a vault. He thought he was using Emma's marriage to save his legacy. He thought he was playing a sophisticated game of chess, sacrificing pawns to protect the king. But Otis was only looking at the plastic pieces right in front of him. He never bothered to look across the table at the person actually moving the board. Every smile he offered to a creditor, every toast he made to a potential partner, only deepened the irony. He was spending money he didn't possess to impress people he couldn't afford. The catering bill alone probably equated to a month of his struggling payroll. I watched him signal a waiter to bring another bottle of champagne to the head table. The performance was exhausting to watch, a desperate act of preservation from a man who refused to read the writing on the wall. The string quartet transitioned into a lively waltz. The charade continued under the glittering lights. Otis laughed, tossing his head back. He was a man walking confidently over a trapdoor. Ignorance is a fragile luxury. I stepped away from the cold marble pillar and walked toward the quiet corner near the terrace doors. Corbin was still there, sitting vigil beside his younger sister. Lena was tracing the intricate floral pattern on her cashmere blanket with a pale finger. She looked tired. The harsh reality of her chronic condition didn't pause for a wedding reception. The lavish surroundings only made her fragility more apparent. Corbin looked up as I approached. His eyes widened slightly in surprise. He started to stand, a complex mix of relief, guilt, and anxiety crossing his young face. He was carrying the weight of 2 generations on his shoulders. I raised a hand, gesturing gently for him to stay seated. I didn't want to draw Otis's attention just yet. The timing had to be precise. I pulled up a velvet chair next to Lena. The little girl looked at me with cautious curiosity. She had Otis's stubborn chin, but her eyes were strikingly different. They were gentle and observant. "Hello, Lena," I said softly, keeping my voice level with the music. "Hi," she replied. Her voice was thin, lacking the breath support of a healthy child. "Are you a friend of Corbin's?" "You could say that," I smiled. "I brought you something." "A wedding favor?" I opened my small, navy clutch purse. I reached inside and pulled out a silver hairpin. It was shaped like a swallow in mid-flight. It was an antique piece, slightly tarnished around the edges from decades of storage. It belonged to my mother. It was the only item I had managed to grab from the hallway dresser before Otis locked the front door 21 years ago. I placed the cool metal bird in the palm of her small hand. "This belonged to someone very special," I told her quietly. "She wore it in her hair when she needed to feel brave. I think it looks much better on you." Lena's fingers closed carefully around the silver pin. A genuine, bright spark lit up her tired eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, tucking her hand against her chest. Corbin swallowed hard. He looked from the vintage hairpin to my face. He knew exactly what that piece of jewelry meant. He knew the painful history it carried and the significance of handing it over. "Is it done?" Corbin asked. His voice barely carried over the ambient noise of the ballroom. "The financial transfer clears on Monday," I answered, keeping my gaze on Lena. "Her treatment protocol resumes tomorrow morning. She will be under Dr. Harrison's direct supervision at the main campus." Corbin exhaled a shaky, ragged breath. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands for a brief second. The crushing pressure of the past 6 months finally lifted off his chest. He didn't have to choose between his father's destructive ego and his little sister's survival anymore. "Thank you," Corbin muttered into his palms. I touched his tuxedo sleeve lightly. "Go be with your bride. Enjoy the evening." I stood up and smoothed my dress. I looked at the silver swallow resting in Lena's lap one last time. It was time. Otis was holding court near the open bar, bathed in the warm glow of the accent lights. A group of junior healthcare executives surrounded him, laughing loudly at a golf joke he had just delivered. He held a crystal glass of scotch in one hand and used the other to gesture expansively, commanding the space. I stood a few yards away in the shadows, analysing the performance. Corbin walked past the loud group, intending to join Emma on the crowded dance floor. Otis noticed the movement. He smoothly stepped away from his captivated audience and intercepted his son. The transition from jovial, welcoming host to authoritative dictator happened in a fraction of a second. The mask slipped only for Corbin. Otis gripped Corbin's shoulder. His fingers dug deeply into the fine fabric of the tuxedo jacket. The knuckles turned white under the strain. It was a subtle gesture of physical control, invisible to the chatting guests, but painfully obvious to anyone who understood the family dynamic. "Stand up straight," Otis muttered through a forced, photogenic smile. Harrison is watching us from the stairs. Don't look like a nervous kid. You represent the future of this company tonight." Corbin's jaw tightened. He didn't pull away immediately. "I'm just going to dance with my wife. Dad, let go." "You are going to secure this merger," Otis corrected. His voice dropped an octave, dripping with menace. "We need Harrison's public endorsement for the Apex Capital. If you embarrass me out there, or if you complain about the medical bills again, I will cut the clinic off completely. Do we have a clear understanding?" He was using Lena's vulnerable life as a literal bargaining chip. He was doing it in a room packed with people, hidden behind a polite, fatherly pat on the back. It was extortion dressed up in evening wear. Corbin didn't flinch. He didn't offer the usual stammering apologies. He just looked at his father with a new, quiet pity. Corbin already knew the truth. He knew the threats were empty. He knew the corporate accounts were drained. The fear that Otis relied upon was gone. "I understand, Dad," Corbin said evenly. He pulled his shoulder free from Otis's rigid grip and walked toward the dance floor without looking back. Otis frowned. He wasn't accustomed to Corbin walking away so easily. He expected resistance, followed by immediate submission. The lack of fear unsettled him. He turned back toward the bar, his eyes scanning the crowd for reassurance, searching for a friendly face to validate his authority. Instead, his eyes found me. I didn't avert my gaze when our eyes met. I stood perfectly still, offering no reaction to his sudden shift in demeanor. The realization that I had witnessed the entire exchange with his son flashed across his face. A flicker of genuine irritation replaced his manufactured confidence. He hated being observed. He hated the idea that someone outside his control could see the cracks in his armor. He squared his shoulders, preparing for a confrontation. The trap was set. Otis didn't hesitate. He set his empty scotch glass on a passing waiter's tray and marched directly toward my corner of the room. His steps were heavy, aggressive, and deliberate. The polite, charming mask he wore for the investors vanished completely. The tyrant I remembered from my youth returned. He stopped barely 2 feet away. The heavy scent of expensive cologne mixed with the sharp odor of stale alcohol hit me. He tried to use his height to tower over me, a classic intimidation tactic he had favored since we were teenagers. "I thought I told you to stay out of the way," he hissed, keeping his volume low to avoid drawing stares from the nearby tables. "I am standing next to a wall, Otis," I replied calmly. "I hardly think I'm disrupting the flow of your important traffic." He glared at me, his face flushing red. He reached into the inner pocket of his velvet jacket. He pulled out a leather-bound checkbook and a silver fountain pen. He scribbled something quickly, tore the slip of paper loose with a sharp rip, and held it out toward my chest. "Take this," he demanded. I glanced down at the paper. It was a check made out to cash for $500. "Call a cab, get a cheap hotel room, go back to whatever miserable, quiet life you crawled out of," he said. His voice was thick with venom. "You are not going to ruin this night for me. If Harrison's people see you lingering around, they'll start asking questions. I will not have my business reputation stained by a family failure." I looked at the crisp piece of paper. $500. This was the exact price he placed on my dignity. It was the amount he genuinely believed would make me pack up and disappear into the night, just like I did 21 years ago. "I don't need your money," I said. I kept my arms relaxed at my sides. I didn't raise a hand to take the check. "Don't play proud with me, Jessica," he sneered, thrusting the paper closer. "I know exactly what you are. You're a beggar looking for a handout. Take the cash and leave before I have the estate security escort you off the property." I met his gaze directly. My heart rate didn't elevate. My hands were perfectly steady. I felt no fear. I felt nothing but a cold, surgical precision. The power dynamic had shifted long before he ever noticed. "Security won't ask me to leave," I stated. Otis let out a short, harsh laugh. "You really are delusional." He shoved the check forward. I didn't reach for it. The paper slipped from his fingers and fluttered quietly onto the polished hardwood floor. Otis stared at the fallen check, then back up at me. His jaw clenched in sudden frustration. The silence stretched between us, heavier than the music. "Your perception of reality is about to change, Otis," I said. He had no idea. "If you love seeing a bully's empire crumble purely by the law, let me know in the comments." The check remained on the hardwood floor between us. Otis's face hardened. He expected me to kneel. He expected me to bend. He was waiting for the frightened 19-year-old girl to resurface. Instead, I was remembering a quiet Tuesday afternoon, exactly 10 years ago. It was my 30th birthday. I was sitting in a windowless office in downtown Manhattan, across from an estate attorney who looked as weathered as the leather chairs in his lobby. The room smelled of binding glue and stale coffee. The attorney slid a heavy manila envelope across the mahogany desk. The return address bore the embossed seal of my grandfather's legal firm. Walter had been dead for nearly 2 decades. The attorney cleared his throat. He explained that Walter had left highly specific instructions before his passing. The envelope was only to be delivered on my 30th birthday. Provided I had not contacted Otis for financial assistance during that entire 12-year period, Walter was testing my resilience. He needed to verify I could survive outside the family vacuum before he handed me the tools to dismantle it. I broke the aged wax seal. Inside was a dense stack of legal documents and a single handwritten letter. The ink was faded to a soft grey, but Walter's sharp, meticulous cursive was unmistakable. I read the words while the attorney waited in silence. Walter wrote that he loved Otis, but he was not blind. He recognized his grandson's fatal flaws. He knew Otis equated financial dominance with moral superiority. He predicted Otis would eventually steer the family legacy into a brick wall. Walter wanted to protect the foundation of what he had built, and he knew Otis lacked the discipline to do it. The legal documents were not a traditional inheritance. Walter didn't leave me cash. He didn't leave me stock portfolios. He left me a mechanism of control. It was an irrevocable trust. The paperwork bypassed Otis entirely. It named me as the silent, secondary executor of the family's foundational assets. That included the original medical patents, the physical real estate deeds for the manufacturing plants, and the core intellectual property that allowed Otis's entire corporate structure to legally operate. For 21 years. Otis believed he owned the chessboard. He didn't know Walter had legally anchored the most important pieces to the table. And he had handed me the only key. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I thanked the attorney, walked out into the busy New York streets, and went back to work. I hadn't touched the trust in 10 years. I kept it as a shield. I never planned to weaponize it until Corbin made that phone call. Otis stared at me now in the crowded ballroom. He pointed a rigid finger at the check on the floor. His breathing was heavy. "Pick it up," he ordered. I looked at the crumpled piece of paper. Then I looked at the man who had traded his own daughter's health for a temporary illusion of success. I stepped over the check. I left it there. Otis didn't follow me. He couldn't risk a public scene with the Apex health representatives in the room. He turned around, signaled a waiter to sweep up the discarded check, and immediately began smoothing his lapels. He was resetting his mask. I walked toward the perimeter of the room, taking a glass of water from a passing tray. People often misunderstand how corporate power actually functions. They watch movies and assume business wars are won with aggressive shouting matches, dramatic boardroom speeches, or hostile physical confrontations. They think whoever speaks the loudest holds the most authority. True authority is silent. It exists entirely on paper. Otis had spent his life using his physical presence and his aggressive tone to dominate rooms. He bullied Corbyn into submission. He intimidated vendors. He used fear as a management tool. He believed that if he made enough noise, reality would bend to his will. The instrument Walter left me was an irrevocable trust. In the legal world, irrevocable is a terminal word. It means the terms cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the permission of the named beneficiary. Once Walter signed that document and the state notary stamped it, the terms became permanent law. Otis's signature wasn't required. His consent wasn't necessary. His knowledge of the document's existence was legally irrelevant. Otis held the title of CEO. He managed the daily operations, the hiring, and the public relations. But the trust dictated that any major structural shift, including taking on capital debt that exceeded 20% of the company's valuation, required the countersignature of the trust's executor. Me. Otis was currently attempting to secure a $50 million loan from Apex Health. That amount represented nearly 70% of his company's inflated valuation. Even if the Apex board had genuinely approved his application, the funds could never be legally transferred without my explicit, notarized approval. He had spent 6 months wining and dining the wrong people. He was trying to buy the house without speaking to the person who owned the land beneath it. This is the justice of process. It doesn't rely on karma. It doesn't rely on the universe balancing the scales. It relies on the ironclad mechanics of contract law. A notarized signature backed by a federal tax identification number will defeat manipulation and gaslighting every single time. Otis could lie to his friends. He could lie to his son. He could lie to the regional directors. He could not lie to a binding legal contract. For 21 years, I had built my life around that concept. I learned that you don't fight a toxic person by matching their volume. You don't argue with them. You simply remove the ground they are standing on. I watched him from across the ballroom. He was shaking hands with Emma's father. "Dr. Harrison," Otis laughed, pointing at the elaborate ice sculpture. He was relaxed. He thought the finish line was only minutes away. He thought he had successfully navigated the storm and secured his legacy. He had no idea he was already standing at the bottom of the ocean. The mechanism was locked. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly. The string quartet finished their classical piece and began to quietly pack their instruments. A low murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd. Waiters moved swiftly, pouring fresh champagne into empty glasses. The formal toasts were about to begin. I moved toward an empty table near the rear exit. I set my water glass down. I opened my small navy clutch. The leather was soft under my fingertips. My fingers brushed against a smooth metal flash drive. It was standard, black, and unremarkable. It contained 72 pages of indexed financial records. My team at Apex Health had worked quietly over the past 14 days. We didn't just reject Otis's loan application. We executed a systematic debt consolidation strategy. Otis owed money to 4 separate regional supply vendors, 2 private logistics companies, and a commercial bank. They were all nervous. They all knew his company was failing. We offered them an exit strategy. Apex Health purchased Otis's outstanding debts from those entities at a slight premium. They were thrilled to offload the risk. The transactions were private, legal, and executed with digital precision. We didn't need to break any rules. We simply used the rules he had ignored. Otis thought he was managing a dozen different creditors, juggling payments to keep the plates spinning. He didn't know the plates had already fallen. Apex Health was now his sole creditor. He owed us everything. The debt had matured. The grace periods were intentionally bypassed in the acquisition contracts, and the loans were now callable on demand. I closed my clutch. The snap of the metal clasp was sharp. It sounded louder to me than the conversations around me. Corbin stood near the front of the room. He held Emma's hand tightly. He looked tense, his eyes darting nervously toward his father, then toward the corner where Lena sat quietly in her chair. Otis was practically vibrating with excitement. He adjusted his silk tie and patted his chest pocket. He was ready for the coronation. He had staked his identity and his daughter's medical care on this singular moment. A microphone clicked on. The sharp feedback echoed through the speakers, cutting through the low hum of conversation. The guests turned their attention to the small stage erected near the tall windows. "Doctor." Harrison stepped up to the microphone. He adjusted his glasses. He looked out over the crowd of investors, family members, and business partners. His face was unreadable. He tapped the microphone once to ensure it was working. The room fell silent. Otis stood front and center, a few feet from the stage. He held his champagne flute at chest level. He beamed at his new family connection, ready to absorb the praise. I stood at the back, holding my purse. The trap was springing. If you love seeing a bully's empire crumble purely by the law, let me know in the comments below. "Doctor." Harrison tapped the microphone stand twice. The sharp, metallic thud cut through the low hum of conversation. The string quartet stopped playing. Waiters froze in their tracks, stepping back against the silk-lined walls to remain out of sight. The sprawling ballroom settled into a polite, expectant hush. Otis stood 3 feet from the edge of the stage. He held his champagne flute at chest level, squaring his shoulders. He adjusted the lapel of his custom tuxedo. He looked like a man waiting for a coronation. He had spent his entire adult life craving external validation. And this room was packed with the region's elite. He expected Dr. Harrison to deliver a glowing endorsement of the Hayes family legacy. He expected to secure his $50 million loan with a toast. "Doctor." Harrison smiled at the crowd. He was a distinguished man with silver hair and a quiet, commanding presence. He didn't look at Otis. Family is a complicated word. "Doctor," Harrison began. His voice was smooth and practiced. "In the medical field, we often talk about vital signs, a heartbeat, a pulse. But in business, the vital signs are different. They are trust. They are integrity. They are the quiet sacrifices made to keep the system alive. Otis nodded along, his smile wide and fixed. He turned slightly, making sure the venture capitalists at the adjacent tables could see his reaction. He wanted everyone to associate Harrison's words with his leadership. I watched from the shadows near the terrace doors. Corbin stood at the opposite side of the stage, holding Emma's hand. He didn't look at his father. He kept his eyes locked on the floor. The strain of the past 6 months was visible in the rigid line of his jaw. He knew about the bounced checks. He knew about Lena's compromised medical care. Hearing Harrison speak about integrity while his father preened for the cameras made Corbin physically sick. Tonight, we celebrate the union of 2 families. Doctor, Harrison continued. He gestured toward his daughter. Emma stepped forward, the silk of her wedding dress catching the warm light. But before my daughter speaks, I want to acknowledge that true partnership is never built on empty promises. It is built on a foundation of reality. Otis chuckled softly, assuming the comment was a clever jab at market competitors. He raised his glass slightly toward the stage. Emma took the microphone from her father. She didn't mirror Otis's eager smile. Her expression was thoughtful, serious, and incredibly sharp. She looked out over the sea of wealthy guests, her eyes moving deliberately past the politicians and the bankers. "My father is right," Emma said, her voice echoing through the silent room. "Partnership requires reality. And sometimes, reality requires us to look past the people standing in the front row." Otis's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. His brow furrowed. The script he had imagined in his head was beginning to change. He shifted his weight, glancing nervously at the state senator standing to his left. He waited for the applause. "5 years ago, my father's medical network faced a critical shortage," Emma told the quiet room. "We were expanding our pediatric oncology wing. We ran out of funding mid-construction. The banks pulled out. The project was days away from being abandoned." The guests listened intently. This was not a standard wedding toast. It sounded like an investor briefing. Otis lowered his champagne glass. He leaned toward Corbin and whispered something. But Corbin ignored him. "We needed a miracle," Emma continued. She paced slowly across the small wooden stage. "Instead of a miracle, we received a phone call from an anonymous trust. They didn't ask for a seat on the board. They didn't ask for their name to be carved into the side of the new hospital building. They simply reviewed the data, recognized the human cost of failure, and wired the necessary capital." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Businessmen nodded in respect. Otis forced his smile back into place. He assumed Emma was talking about some legendary industry figure, setting up a metaphor about corporate generosity. "That anonymous trust saved our hospital," Emma said. "And over the past month, I learned that the same trust has been quietly saving lives in this very room." She turned her head and looked directly at Lena. The 10-year-old girl sat in her velvet chair, clutching the silver swallow hairpin. A few guests followed Emma's gaze, noticing the pale child in the corner for the first time. Otis's face lost a fraction of its colour. Mentioning Lena's illness publicly was not part of his carefully curated image. It made him look vulnerable. "The CEO of that trust operates in the shadows," Emma said, turning back to the crowd. "She doesn't care about magazine covers. She doesn't care about country club memberships. She cares about leverage, logic, and doing what is right when the system fails. The word hung in the air. Otis blinked. He looked at Emma, a genuine expression of confusion masking his face. He quickly scanned the front row of VIP tables, searching for a high-powered female executive he might have overlooked on the guest list. Emma stepped off the stage. The heavy fabric of her gown rustled as she walked onto the main floor. The crowd naturally parted for her, creating a wide aisle through the center of the ballroom. We were told that the CEO never attends public events, Emma said, walking slowly down the makeshift aisle. We were told she prefers to let the paperwork speak for itself, but tonight she made an exception. Otis turned his body, tracking Emma's movement. He was trying to figure out where she was going. He looked toward the exit, expecting a grand entrance from the lobby. Emma didn't walk toward the lobby. She walked straight past the front tables. She walked past the venture capitalists. She walked past the ice sculpture. The room held its breath. Emma stopped 10 feet from the terrace doors. The ballroom lighting operator, following a pre-arranged cue, shifted a single, soft spotlight away from the main stage. The beam of light moved across the ceiling and landed directly on the back corner of the room. It landed on me. I stood in my plain navy dress, holding my small leather clutch. I didn't shift my posture. I didn't smile. I just looked back at the bride. Otis was standing 30 feet away. He spun around to follow the spotlight. When he saw me illuminated in the center of the beam, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered outrage. He opened his mouth, likely to shout a command for security. But the words died in his throat. Emma raised her glass. She turned her body slightly so the entire room could see her face. "Ladies and gentlemen," Emma said. Her voice was crystal clear over the sound system. "Please raise a glass, not to me, and not to Corbin. I want you to toast the woman who secured the future of my father's hospital, and the woman who currently holds the sole deciding vote on the Apex Health Trust Board." The guests stared at me. The state senator lowered his glass. A prominent banker at table 4 whispered frantically to his wife. "To the CEO of Apex Health," Emma announced, "Jessica Hayes." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the marble floor. No one clapped. No one drank. The guests simply tried to process the cognitive dissonance. The woman standing in the shadows, the woman Otis had actively ignored and marginalized all evening, was the invisible hand controlling the market. Otis stared at me. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen grey. His mind was racing, trying to reconcile the 19-year-old girl he threw into the rain with the corporate titan standing under the spotlight. He had spent 6 months sending desperate emails to my compliance officers. He had submitted his falsified ledgers to my analysts. He had begged for a $50 million lifeline from a faceless entity, never realizing he was begging his own sister. I didn't gloat. I didn't offer a dramatic speech. The truth didn't need decoration. I gave a single, slow nod to Emma, acknowledging the introduction. Corbin walked across the floor and stood next to his new wife. He looked at his father. For the first time in Corbin's life, there was no fear in his eyes. He didn't have to protect Lena from a monster anymore. The monster had just been defanged. Otis took a step forward, his legs trembling slightly. He looked at the crowd, then at Harrison, then back to me. He was drowning, and every person in the room was watching the water rise over his head. Otis stopped breathing entirely. The crystal champagne flute slipped from Otis's hand. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces. Pale, golden liquid pooled around the toe of his polished Italian leather shoe. He didn't look down. He couldn't take his eyes off me. "This is a joke," Otis stammered. His voice lacked the booming resonance he relied on. It sounded thin and weak. "Harrison, this is a sick joke. She's a nobody. She's a thief." "Doctor?" Harrison stood near the stage, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't offer Otis a lifeline. He didn't say a word. I stepped out of the spotlight and walked toward the center of the room. The crowd parted for me. I didn't rush. I walked with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly how the next 5 minutes would end. I stopped just outside the perimeter of the spilled champagne. I unclasped my small navy purse. I pulled out a single sheet of paper and a black flash drive. "You owe Apex Health Trust $50 million across 4 consolidated loans. Otis," I said. My voice was calm, conversational, like a bank teller confirming a deposit. "Those debts matured at noon yesterday. The grace periods were explicitly waived in the acquisition clauses you signed without reading." "You don't own those debts," he shouted, a frantic edge creeping into his tone. "I owe regional banks. I owe logistics firms." "Apex bought those notes 2 weeks ago," I corrected smoothly. "You owe me." Otis shook his head, retreating a half step. "It doesn't matter. You can't call them all at once. The family company has assets. We have the manufacturing plants. I'll liquidate them. I'll sell the patents. I'll bury you in litigation." I held out the single piece of paper. "You can't sell the core assets. Otis, you never could." He stared at the paper. It was a summary copy of Walter's irrevocable trust. The highlighted section clearly detailed the executor's veto power. "Grandpa Walter left me the final vote on any structural liquidation," I explained. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents. "Your signature is legally irrelevant. You can't sell a single warehouse without my notarized consent, and I do not consent." Otis looked from the paper to my face. The illusion of his empire was evaporating in real time. He had built his entire identity on the premise that he owned the board. Now, he realized he didn't even own the pieces. "The debt is past due," I stated, dropping the paper onto the nearest table. "The collateral is locked. Your company changes hands on Monday morning at 9 o'clock. If you love seeing a bully's empire crumble purely by the law, let me know in the comments below." His empire was gone. Panic is a loud, messy emotion. Otis had spent his life pretending to be a tactician, but under pressure, he reverted to a brawler. He couldn't accept the quiet finality of a printed document. "Fraud!" Otis roared. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. He turned to the crowd, raising his hands in a frantic plea. "She forged it. Walter hated her. He threw her out. She fabricated that trust to steal my company." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Accusations of federal forgery were serious. Otis spotted a man sitting at a prime table near the stage. It was Neil Davis, his lead corporate attorney. "Neil," Otis yelled, pointing at the lawyer. "Get over here. Look at this garbage. File an injunction right now. Call the police and have her arrested for fraud." Neil Davis stood up slowly. He adjusted his glasses and walked toward us. He looked nervous, clutching his leather briefcase. He was used to drafting supply contracts, not mediating public family warfare. Otis snatched the summary sheet from the table and shoved it into Neil's chest. "Read it, it's fake. Tell them it's fake." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice to defend myself. I just turned my head slightly toward the grand entrance doors. A woman in a sharp grey suit stepped into the ballroom. It was Rose, the Senior Compliance Counsel for Apex Health. She carried a thick, bound legal folder. She walked past the stunned guests with practiced efficiency and stopped beside me. "Mr. Davis," Rose said, her voice crisp and professional. She didn't look at Otis. She handed the heavy folder directly to the opposing lawyer. "Inside, you will find the original irrevocable trust filed in state court 21 years ago. You will also find a federal handwriting analysis of Walter Hayes' signature, certified by an independent forensic auditor last week." Neil Davis opened the folder. He flipped past the first 3 pages. His eyes scanned the state seal, the notary stamps, and the federal certification. "You will also find the consolidated debt transfer logs," Rose added quietly. "Apex Health legally acquired the notes. The default terms are ironclad." Otis grabbed Neil's shoulder. "Well, tell them it's a forgery. Neil, do your job." Neil Davis slowly closed the folder. He didn't hand it back to Rose. He looked at Otis. The corporate attorney recognized a legal firing squad when he saw one. There was no loophole. There was no defense. "Otis," Neil said, his voice flat, "the notary seals are verified. The forensic analysis is certified by a federal contractor." He took a step back, pulling his shoulder out of Otis's grip. "I cannot file a frivolous injunction against a verified state document. It would cost me my license." Neil turned, picked up his briefcase from the table, and walked quickly toward the exit. Otis stood alone in the center of the room. The lawyer was gone. The investors were watching. The paper was real. He had nothing left. The transition of power was remarkably dull. There were no shouting matches in the boardroom. There were no dramatic security escorts. The mechanics of corporate failure are usually quiet and bureaucratic. The following Monday morning, I stood in the lobby of the Hayes Medical Solutions headquarters. The building smelled of old carpet and floor wax. At exactly 9 o'clock, Otis walked out of the executive elevator. He wore a grey suit that suddenly looked a size too big. He carried a single, thin cardboard box containing a few personal photographs and a desk clock. He didn't look at the receptionist. He didn't look at the junior analysts standing near the water cooler. He walked straight toward the revolving glass doors. I stood near the security desk, holding a coffee cup. Otis paused just before pushing through the glass. He turned his head and met my eyes. He looked hollowed out. The arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by the dull, flat stare of a man who had lost the only thing he valued. He didn't say a word. I didn't offer a parting insult. The silence between us was final. He pushed the glass door and stepped out onto the busy pavement, disappearing into the morning pedestrian traffic. I walked into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The corner office was already being cleaned. The first directive I issued as the new chairman was a complete audit of the manufacturing line. The second directive was a permanent funding allocation for the pediatric research division at Dr. Harrison's hospital network. The company wasn't dead. It just needed a surgeon instead of a salesman. Later that afternoon, I drove to the main hospital campus. I bypassed the standard waiting areas and walked up to the VIP pediatric floor. The Apex Health Trust had fully absorbed the cost of the specialized suite. I looked through the glass window of room 412. Lena was sitting up in bed. The harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced with soft, warm lamps. A top-tier respiratory specialist was adjusting her IV drip, chatting cheerfully with her. The dark circles under Lena's eyes were already beginning to fade. She held a sketchbook in her lap. Pinned neatly to the collar of her hospital gown was the silver swallow. Corbin sat in a chair beside the bed. He was reading a book aloud to her. Emma sat next to him, her head resting on his shoulder. They looked like a normal, exhausted, happy young couple. The suffocating weight of Otis's blackmail was gone from the room. I didn't knock on the glass. I didn't need their gratitude or a tearful thank you. I just needed to see that the system was working the way Walter had intended. I watched them for a few minutes, feeling the tight knot in my chest finally loosen. The house was clean. A month later, the frantic pace of the corporate takeover settled into a predictable rhythm. The vendors were paid. The supply chains were stabilized. The panic that had infected the company under Otis's leadership was replaced by a quiet, methodical focus. It was a Sunday morning. The sun was bright over the Hudson Valley. I sat at the large oak table in the dining room of my estate. The smell of fresh coffee and toasted bread filled the air. The doorbell rang. I didn't employ a weekend butler, so I walked down the hall and opened the front door myself. Corbin stood on the porch. He was holding a cardboard carrier with 3 coffees. Emma stood beside him, carrying a white bakery box that smelled heavily of cinnamon and powdered sugar. Behind them, standing on her own 2 feet without the aid of a wheelchair, was Lena. Her colour had returned. The specialised therapy was working. She wore a bright yellow jacket and a pair of scuffed canvas sneakers. "We brought breakfast," Corbin said. He offered a small, hesitant smile. He was still learning how to navigate a relationship without the constant threat of conditions or punishment. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let them pass. We sat around the oak table in the kitchen. There was no formal agenda. There were no hidden motives. We talked about the weather, Emma's new job at the clinic, and Lena's sudden obsession with geology. Corbin laughed at a joke Emma made. It was a genuine, relaxed sound. I poured a cup of coffee and watched them. This was the exact scene Otis had tried to deny me 21 years ago. He thought he could excise me from the family by locking a door and spreading rumours. He thought family was a rigid structure built on titles and control. He didn't realise that family is fluid. It breaks apart and it reforms. It skips a generation, bypasses the toxic elements, and regrows where the soil is actually healthy. Lena reached across the table and took a cinnamon roll from the box. She looked at me, her eyes bright and clear. "Corbin says you own a whole company now," Lena said, her mouth slightly full of pastry. "I manage a company. Yes," I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. "Are you going to be the boss forever?" she asked, with the blunt curiosity of a child. I looked at Corbin. He was smart. He possessed Walter's quiet observation skills and none of Otis's vanity. He just needed time to learn the mechanics of the business without a shadow hanging over him. "No, not forever," I told Lena. "I'm just holding on to the keys until someone else is ready to take them." Corbin met my eyes across the table. He understood the implication. The tension in his shoulders dropped. We ate the rest of the breakfast in peace. The paperwork for the new foundation took 3 weeks to finalize. I sat in my downtown office, reviewing the final draft of the charter. The legal language was dry, but the purpose was precise. I used the profits generated from the recovery of Hayes Medical Solutions to establish the Walter Hayes Pediatric Endowment. It was structured as a separate, impenetrable trust. The mandate was singular to provide immediate, unconditional financial assistance to families with chronically ill children, specifically targeting cases where medical care was hindered by custody disputes or financial manipulation. I signed the last page with a black fountain pen. The ink soaked into the heavy paper, making the commitment permanent. Otis was a symptom of a larger disease. There are thousands of people who use money as a weapon against the vulnerable. They use medical bills to trap spouses, manipulate children, and enforce compliance. The endowment was designed to break those specific chains. I capped the pen and placed it on the desk. I didn't feel a sudden rush of euphoria. The closure I felt was quiet and heavy. The 19-year-old girl who had walked to the bus station in the rain was finally allowed to rest. She didn't need to prove her worth to an empty house anymore. She had built her own. My assistant knocked lightly on the glass door. She stepped into the office, holding a sleek silver tablet. "The board is ready for the quarterly review. Miss Hayes," she said softly. "Tell them I'll be right there," I replied. I stood up and walked over to the large window overlooking the city. The traffic below moved in endless, silent rivers of red and white lights. The world is a loud place. It rewards people who shout the loudest and push the hardest. But endurance has its own gravity. Walter was right. The hawk doesn't make a sound until the hunt is over. I didn't need to destroy Otis to win. I just needed to survive long enough to expose the math. The math did the rest. I picked up the foundation charter and placed it in the outbox on my desk. It was ready for the courier. Tomorrow, the first round of grants would be issued. A dozen families would wake up to find their medical debts zeroed out. They wouldn't know my name. They wouldn't know the history of the money. They would just know they were safe. I turned away from the window and walked toward the boardroom. The air in the hallway was cool and still. The company was secure. Lena was breathing easily. The legacy Walter tried to protect was finally anchored in concrete. The past was closed. I was ready for work. People often cling to the idea that blood dictates loyalty. We are told from childhood that family is an unbreakable bond, a mandatory obligation that requires endless forgiveness and infinite patience. Society pushes a narrative that walking away from a relative is a failure of character. That narrative is a trap. Blood is a biological accident. It does not excuse cruelty. It does not grant someone a permanent license to demean your character, leverage your stability, or exploit your vulnerabilities. If a bridge is rotten, standing on it out of a sense of loyalty won't stop it from collapsing under your weight. Sometimes, the most profound act of self-preservation is turning your back on the table where you were told you belong. You don't have to stay and argue your worth to people who have already decided you have none. It takes a specific kind of courage to walk into the dark with nothing but a canvas bag. It feels like defeat in the moment. It feels like the end of the world. But distance provides clarity. Once you step outside the ecosystem of manipulation, you realize the power they held over you was an illusion sustained entirely by your own fear. Legacy isn't what you inherit. It is what you protect. Walter understood that. He knew the building blocks of a family weren't property deeds or corporate titles. The foundation was respect. When Otis threw me out, he thought he was protecting his inheritance. In reality, he was setting fire to the only thing that actually mattered. I didn't return to the Hudson Valley estate to demand an apology. I knew Otis was incapable of offering one. I returned because a young man asked for help to save a child. The reclamation of the company was merely a mechanism to ensure they were never held hostage again. I sit at my own table now. The chairs are filled with people who understand the value of quiet loyalty. We don't trade affection for compliance. We don't use fear as leverage. If you are standing in the rain right now, staring at a locked door, understand this. The lock is not a punishment. It is an exit strategy. Stop knocking, turn around and start walking. The world is wider than the house you left behind. Build your own fortress. Make it strong, make it quiet, and make it yours. And when the time comes, let the paperwork speak for itself. If Jessica's journey inspired you, please share this story with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and undeniable dignity.